Court, Delhi, in India. She's been teaching there since 2019. She received her PhD in history from the University of Virginia in the year 2022. The date, she just told me, is because of delays caused by COVID. When you couldn't travel, you couldn't, I suppose, go back and defend your thesis. So that's that. Her doctoral research focused on the protracted processes of nation building and citizenship making in the Eastern Himalaya at the cusp of India's transition from colonial rule. So these would be early and mid 20th century decades. She teaches courses on Tibet and the Himalaya, migration, citizenship, and advanced research methods. She tweets at Chawla Swati and the hashtag Himalayan Histories. So it's yours. If you want to say more about your work in the beginning or later, you're welcome to do that. And also more about Jindal, please do that as well. Yeah.
Has anyone been to Delhi?
Yeah.
You have. Okay. We are not very far, so the next time you're in Delhi, let me know and I'll take you to campus. So thank you very much for having me and Dr. Hutta for practically letting me invite myself. I'm delighted to be here and I'm also looking forward to the conference. I know many of you are volunteering, so I guess we'll see each other again then. And thanks Angela and also Rook for all the work behind the scenes. So the paper that I'm presenting, it's developed from one section of my dissertation work, which traces the enduring legacy of colonial racism in the work of a man called Nari Rustomji, and I'll talk more about him in a bit, and how he depicts migrants from Nepal in the Eastern Himalaya. Now, Rustomji lived from 1919 to 93. He was an influential Indian official who served in the highest echelons of the colonial and post-colonial Indian administration in the northeast and in the kingdoms of Sikkim and Bhutan. So you see here all his postings, Assam, Nepal, Nagaland, Sikkim, Bhutan, of course. So I'm going to be drawing on his published work. So these are some of the books he wrote. The quote that you see here is from his friend who was the last Maharaja of Sikkim. So he wrote to Rustomji about this book called Imperiled Frontier, and he said, don't call your book Himalayan Fringe, Cultures in Peril. So just the name fringe, I know some of you work on international cooperation, some of you said you've studied sociology. So just this word fringe, anyone just like make this a little bit of a conversation. What's the first word that comes to your mind when someone says fringe? Fringe of the Himalaya. Is that any associations, any words that come to your mind? Anyone? So fringe would mean
Tibet.
Tibet as a place, yes.
It's in the border.
On the borders, yes. But is it a positive association, a negative? Why is it negative?
Well, it means it's pushed.
It's yes, very good, thank you. So his friend who was from Sikkim said that Sikkim, Bhutan and Arunachal are within the Himalaya, they are not the fringes. And I don't want you to be unpopular with your friends in Sikkim or in the region. And then Rustomji changed the title of that book from Himalayan Fringe Cultures in Peril to Imperiled Frontiers. So he still retained this idea, but instead of fringe, he called them frontiers. And then he wrote books on Sikkim and Bhutan. So I'm drawing on some of his published work. His private papers that are housed at the Prime Minister's Museum and Library. This used to be called the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi, Teen Murti. So the name has changed now. And I'm also drawing on archival documents from the Sikkim Agency at the National Archives of India and Nepal-related files from the Sikkim Darbar that are digitized under the British Library's Endangered Archives project. So this is actually something you can all look up if you just Google Endangered Archives Project Sikkim. This would pop up high-resolution scans of these files from the Sikkim Darbar now freely available to all of us. So that's a wonderful resource. A small part of this work as parts of chapters on Sikkim and Bhutan's negotiations with the cabinet mission in the months leading up to independence appeared in a special issue on India's borderlands with the India Quarterly and in an edited volume called South Asia Unbound, New International Histories of the Subcontinent with Leiden University Press. So I'm now developing this section based on Rustomji's writing for a different article. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to workshop it with all of you. I'll speak for about 30-35 minutes and then we can open it up. So let's go back to Rustomji's bio, let's stay there. Okay, so during the twilight of the British Raj in India in 1942, as the Second World War raged on, there were three friends. They were probationers at the Indian Civil Service training camp in Dehradun, which is, all of you know, in the Western Himalaya. Successful ICS candidates no longer spend their probationary year in a British university. This used to be the case before the war, but now the course had moved to Dehradun. While most trainees would go on to postings in British Indian provinces, there were a few from the so-called native states. So these were princely states at the time of India's independence. Depending on how you count, there were more than 500 of these princely states. So before independence, many of them would go for this ICS training, and they were included to learn the fundamentals of administration and to establish contacts with the future administrators of independent India. Now, within a decade of taking the course, these three friends, who I'll talk about, would assume the highest positions in the administration of the Himalayan kingdoms of Sikkim and Bhutan and shape their relationship with newly independent India and with Tibet and China. The personal biographies of these friends are evidence of a Janus-based syncretic and cosmopolitan Tibetan and Himalayan world under British imperialism. Anyone know what Janus means? Janus-based? So it's this two-faced, two-faced. So one face facing forward and one backward. So one of them, Palden Thonduk Namgyal, who's in the middle here, was actually compared to Janus. It was said about him that he had one face of a progressive, educated, and enlightened Democrat, and the other of a reactionary, prejudiced, corrupt, and communal autocrat. Thonduk Namgyal received a monastic education in Tibet and Sikkim, alongside a Western-style education at St. Joseph's Convent in Kalimpong, St. Joseph's in Darjeeling, and British Cotton School in the summer capital of Shimla. So this man actually was, like I said, the last Maharaja of Sikkim. And at the time of the ICS course, that's 1941, he was the Maharaja Kumar, the heir apparent. His older brother, Paljor Namgyal, had been killed in a flying accident while working for the Royal Air Force. The British political officer in Sikkim, Basil Gould, had taken a personal interest in his upbringing to ensure that the princes and princesses in Sikkim should be well equipped to feel at home in a Western-style society as well as their own. Now, that's another photo of him. Sorry, these photos are very bad, I know, but that's him, the third person. And that is N.K. Rustomji, our hero in classes there. So Palden Thonduk Namgyal was believed to be the reincarnation of his late uncle, Maharaja Sitkyong Tulku, and also recognized as the spiritual head of Sikkim's most revered monasteries, Kodang and Rumtek. That's a photo, as you can see, of Sitkyong Tulku. With him is the 13th Dalai Lama. So the current one is the 14th, as you know, so his predecessor, who had fled Manchu forces and had sought refuge in British India. So this is, I talk about this in my other work, why is it that Tibetans end up in India in exile? And actually, the 14th Dalai Lama is not the first Dalai Lama who sought refuge in India. So that's the 13th Dalai Lama, and you also see Charles Bell, who was the British political officer in Sikkim. So if you see, two of them are seated and Sitkyong Tulku is standing. So Alex McKay, historian, uses this as the cover image for his book. And he says that this photo actually captures the relationship between Sikkim, Tibet, and Bhutan. So you see who's seated and who is standing. So that. Anyway, back to our three friends. So joining Thondup was his cousin, Jigme Palden Dorchi, that's this guy with Nehru, who you would recognize. Jigme's mother, Rani Chuni, was the sister of Thondup's father, Maharaja Tashi Namgyal. There will be a quiz at the end, so everyone has to know her, okay? Who is related to whom? Okay, so Jigme's father, Raja Sonam Tokye Dorji, was the assistant to the political officer in Sikkim and also a CIE, which was the companion of the Indian Empire. The Dorji children, like their Namgyal cousins, so for your quiz, here is a family tree. How they are related. Basically, the point is that the aristocracy in Sikkim and Bhutan are related. And the Dorji family is also related to the Bhutanese royal family of Wangchuk, and they have a connection with Tibet. So that's the point. Not even if you forget the specifics, remember that. So the Dorjis, as I said, are subsequently related to the Bhutanese royal house of Wangchuk by marriage. Jigme's sister Kesang marries Jigme Dorji Wangchuk in 1951, who became the king in the following year. The families also share a connection with the Dalai Lama and with the Tibetan aristocracy in Lhasa, so this would become important later. During his exile in British India, the photo that we just saw, the 13th Dalai Lama stays for 3 months at the Dorji family's house called Bhutan House in Kalimpong. And even the 14th Dalai Lama stayed there in 57. A Tibetan tutor from Lhasa accompanies them to the training camp, the ICS training camp. Okay, so the official discourse of the British administration in this region stressed their superiority in modern infrastructure, education, health, and administration, which kingdoms like Sikkim and Bhutan, they said they would do well to emulate with Indian aid. However, the real geopolitical motive was informed by colonial surveyors, botanists, and cartographers who had brought back intelligence on the commercial value of Himalayan forests and fertile lowlands as early as the first mission commissioned by Warren Hastings in 1774. The production interests of the plantation economy had led to the search for fertile territories beyond Bengal and Assam. The British Indian government employed migrant labor from the plains of eastern India and from Nepal in the tea plantations, which had lasting demographic, social, and political consequences in both Sikkim and Bhutan. Now, when Jigme Dorji is admitted to the ICS camp, since he was the son of the Bhutanese prime minister, he wasn't really a prince, strictly speaking. They made an exception for him since he wasn't a prince, but the British at that time believed that he is the one man who might in future have the chance of applying common sense methods to some of Bhutan's forests. So that's really the purpose. He will take special interest in the problem of making Bhutan's forest yield some revenue and may tend to their preservation. A similar motive had prompted the admission of the Sikkimese forest officer Bhim Bahadur to the force. So now coming to the third friend, so three friends, the Prince of Sikkim, the son of the Prime Minister of Bhutan, and N.K. Rustomji, who's called Uncle Rusti. So let's go back to his bio. Okay. Uncle Rusti by Jigme and Thondup. Anyone knows Rustomji, the surname? Where this is, it's a Parsi surname. So yeah, that will also become relevant later. So he, like Thondup Namgyal and Jigme Dorji, he also had received an eclectic education, in his case, in Lahore, in Bedford, and at Cambridge. So he says it was through Beethoven that I was prepared for receiving the compassionate Buddha's message, as all of us are, I suppose. We listen to Beethoven and then we become Buddhists, I don't know. So he had joined the ICS in 1941, the year after Olaf Caro's very influential Mongolian fringe thesis, which I'll talk about. And the echoes of that thesis abound in his writing. So let's see one of them. So he says, Sikkim and Bhutan were for me airy fairy kingdoms in the remote vastness of the Tibetan frontier, of no consequence to the world at large. But I was fascinated by the two cousins, so Palinthondup Namgyal and Jigmedorji, and their endearing mannerisms. Their Mongoloid features set them apart from the rest of the trainees. They invited me to spend my vacations with them in their homes in Gangtok and Kalimpong, and thus started my Himalayan pilgrimage. So, any thoughts on this quote? Anything? What does it say? Let's say this reveals to us nothing about Sikkim and Bhutan, and it reveals to us everything about the writer, N.K. Rustomji. What does it tell us about the writer? What is he saying about them? Anything? You have to earn your tea, guys. Come on. Is it respectful?
Not really.
Affectionate? Really? Not really? Why not? Well,
You saw twin personality movie.
he saw what?
How twin personality.
Okay. Anything else? Take your time. Airy fairy kingdoms. Is that respectful? No? Why not? You're nodding your head, shaking your head, sorry.
Well, I think making it like a fairy tale type of exoticizing.
Exoticizing them, yes, yes. Of no consequence to the world at large. Yeah? So more, and endearing mannerisms, Mongoloid features.
Yeah.
Okay?
You saw the kingdom as some primitive place.
Primitive, yes. He doesn't use the word, but you're quite right. Where is the clue here that he sees them as primitive?
Airy fairy.
Airy fairy, okay.
Remote vastness.
Remote vastness, very good. Okay, okay, great. So his racialization of Himalayan peoples was inflected with a Buddhist civilizational bias. He assumed the superiority of Tibetan Buddhism, which he sees as the beating heart of Sikkim and Bhutan, and he assumes that the Tibetan Buddhists are superior to the pre-Buddhists in the two kingdoms and also to the Nepalese, which we'll come to. So he says that there is no doubt that the Tibetan Buddhist immigrants were, during the time of their original entry into Sikkim, at a higher level of cultural and material development than the indigenous Lepchas of Sikkim. The Buddhist religion, even in its adulterated form, so that's the idea that Lamaism, quote unquote, is an adulterated form of Buddhism, had a civilizing effect upon the Tibetans over the course of 5 centuries. The Lepchas, and he's talking about Sikkim here, but very similar the Bhutan book is very similar. On the other hand, were still children of caves and forests. So, again, all the red flags here. Even when I roamed amongst them as recently as 30 years back, they were simple, childlike folk who had seen nothing of the outside world. Okay, so just like this one. So a corollary of privileging Sikkim and Bhutan's Tibetan and Buddhist connections was his attitude towards the Nepalese, whom he considered the inferior racial and civilizational other. So in Bhutan, the Dragon Kingdom in crisis, he says, the Bhutanese are mainly of Tibetan stock. So again, this word stock comes from this racial vocabulary. Save for the settlers in southern Bhutan who have immigrated during the course of the last century from Nepal and the Darjeeling district of West Bengal. So there are the original inhabitants and then there are the settlers. So he's making that distinction. The Nepalese at the time constituted a quarter, this is the 1940s, of Bhutan's population. And there were strict restrictions against their settling north of the specified middle line in Bhutan, drawing a parallel with Sikkim, where they had long outnumbered the putative, the so-called original inhabitants. So Rustomji actually supported Bhutan's efforts to stop the process of Nepali migration before it assumes unmanageable proportions. Since he says the Nepalese are a polygamous race, which is the title of the paper, among whom a household of 3 or 4 wives and a dozen to 15 children is not an uncommon phenomenon. So what is he saying here? Anybody? Sorry, I should have put this on a slide, but I'll say it again, and then you tell me what you think he's saying and how it might compare to this. The Nepalese are a polygamous race, among whom a household of 3 or 4 wives and a dozen to 15 children is not an uncommon phenomenon. And Bhutan should stop the process of Nepali migration before it assumes unmanageable proportions. What's he saying? Silence is also fine, always fine.
Well, the last part of it is Bhutan. He thinks Bhutan is being overrun by Nepalis.
Yeah, and he says Sikkim has already been overrun by Nepalis. So if Bhutan doesn't take measures, it would also be overrun. So this, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with this line of thinking. Many parts of the world, the migrants are taking over. They are going to outnumber the original population, and therefore what? So what's the danger if migrants outnumber the original population? What would happen? So you must have heard this in other contexts, if not Sikkim and Bhutan. What happens? What's the fear? What would the place lose?
Their identity.
Their identity, yes. Their cultural identity, it would be lost. So that's what he's saying. Now, just a little background here. So in 1940, the British Indian Foreign Secretary Olaf Karo had conceptualized India's Mongolian fringe in an official note. So Karo is talking about India's, what he called the inner ring of defense, which comprised Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and the northeast frontier tracts, including Assam. Now, Karo believed that the inhabitants of this region had a predominantly Mongolian population, again within quotes, a characterization that in this case applied to most peoples of Central and Eastern Asia, who were considered to be of an inferior racial stock than people of the plains. Okay, so Karo is here talking about how does India secure its defense, British India secure its defense, and he makes a distinction between the plainsmen and the people on the fringes. Okay, and the people in the plains he thinks are superior. Robert Reed, who was a contemporary of Karo's and had served as the governor of Assam from 37 to 42, so it's roughly the same years, you would see, said of the people of the excluded areas of Assam that neither racially, historically, culturally, nor linguistically have they any affinity with the people of the plains or with the people of India proper. So, you know, this actually continues to this day. There is India proper, and then there are these other places, okay? So the Assam Valley contained, he says, a substratum of Mongolian population whose culture was different from, rather than lower than, that of the backward areas of India proper, to which they neither historically nor racially belong. So this is, like, again, constructing that difference. The chasm between the Mongolian populations on India's northern and eastern fringes and the inhabitants of the plains was, it's firm and it's self-evident for people like Karo and Reed. Now, Rustomji, who joins the civil service in 41, you know, so very much this is the dominant thinking. First, so two things to remember here. One, that there is a racial difference that is, in this theorization. And the other, that this racial difference is connected to securing India's defenses. So the question is, who can we trust? So we can't trust these people that are different. Okay, so this has a very long afterlife in India, and you'll see a little bit of that in Rustomji's writing. Now, Karo also said that Nepal, which supplied a large contingent of regular troops to the Indian army, so Karo advises India to consider itself paternalistically bound to maintain, so these are his words, bound to maintain an unobtrusive tutelage over Nepal. So again, this word tutelage, you know, so you could see there is a hierarchy here. In his thinking, the Nepalese, so this is Karo, not Rustomji, but very similar, a philoprogenitive and colonizing race whose tendency to expansion was feared and hated by the other states. So basically this thinking that the Nepalese are going to outnumber us it's older than Rustomji, and this is where he's getting it from. Nepalese cultivators, artisans and tradesmen, Karo says, have spread widely, so again this phrase, into Sikkim and Bhutan, and were also found in large numbers in Assam. Now, Thondup Namgyal and Jigme Dorji's admission in the course is an evidence of the complex political and administrative structure of the British Empire in India at the time, which comprises the British provinces, so which is, it's British India, the princely states, which in the archives is often referred to as Indian India, so that's India that's under the administration of princes, not directly under the British, and a number of border states, each of which has a special arrangement with India. So all of these states in the Himalaya. And this is a complexity that the successor government inherits in 1947, okay? So British India, border states, each has a separate treaty, and the princely states. Rustomji's easy friendship with the two cousins was cemented by a shared sense of foreignness from India that drew him more closely to them than his fellow cadets. So this is, again, I'm quoting him. He says they were foreign because of their Mongoloid features, which set them apart. And he says, I too am foreign because he had spent 15 years in the UK and because he was Parsi. There's shared sense of being out of place within the heart of the Indian administrative core in the 1940s, and their identification, whether by birth, vocation, or friendship, with an interconnected Tibetan cultural world, were both indications of things to come in the Eastern Himalaya. Now, following the course, Rustomji was posted to Assam as an advisor to the governor of Assam for the northeastern frontiers, the 25 Khasi statelets, and the princely states of Manipur, Cooch Behar, and Tripura. So if you are aware of India's map, sorry, I should have had a picture here. These are all states in what are now called the Northeast, the 7 states in the Northeast. He identified with the colonial imperative of securing India's defenses and the post-colonial imperative of consolidating territory. He speaks with detached pride of manipulating the merger of Cooch Behar with Bengal and of the 25 Khasi states with Assam. He was confident that there was not much opposition to our here is Indian, taking over Tripura and constituting it as a union territory, and no qualms about admitting that the ruler of Manipur had to be coerced into signing away his kingdom. Thus, he was in a unique position to offer advice and assistance when Jigme and Thondup applied to him for friendly counsel in June of 1947, a mere 2 months or so before the transfer of power in India, as they anxiously deliberated the future of their kingdom. So this work, actually, I'm also presenting the Sikkim and Bhutan part on Friday. So I hope some of you will come back. There will be no quiz then, because I won't have this much time. So yeah, use this opportunity. Anyway, but basically Sikkim and Bhutan, at the cusp of independence, were worried that India would treat them on par with the other princely states. So they were worried that they would be forced to join India, and they wanted to say that we are not, we don't belong with India, we have always had a special relationship. And part of why we don't belong with India is because we are neither Hindu nor Muslim, we are Buddhist. So we have a uniquely distinct way of life, and we should be allowed to preserve it. Now, remember I told you the Nepalese, who are Hindu, constitute about half of Sikkim's population and a quarter or more of Bhutan's population. So this is a time when Bhutan and Sikkim are anxious to present themselves. So so Bhutan says, for example, we have nothing in common with India. Racially, linguistically, culturally, socially, we are distinct from India. So what do we do now with the fact that there are all these people who are not Buddhist and who have actually a lot more in common with India? So that's the anxiety. So I'll talk about that bit on Friday. But during the time that Rustomji is posted in Sikkim and Bhutan, he aids the kingdom's transition from colonial rule to the drawing up of fresh treaties with post-colonial India. His public and private correspondence reveals a very similar racialization of Himalayan peoples, a Buddhist civilizational bias, like I said, and a marked prejudice towards the towards the Nepalese in Sikkim and Bhutan, whom he considers inferior. So now let's see. This is a long quote, and I'll end with that. But let's spend like 3:35, 5-7 minutes, and unpack it together. So Sikkim, a Himalayan tragedy. The book comes in 1987, but he's talking about the period, roughly the maybe the 40s, 50s, 60s. So he says the problems arising from outsiders infiltrating into underpopulated and underdeveloped areas are to be found worldwide. The American Indians are now conscious of the extent to which they have been exploited in the past and are at long last being awarded compensation by the courts for the expropriation of their lands. The infiltration of outsiders into sparsely populated regions of India's northeastern frontiers is no known phenomenon, though it has been highlighted in the recent years after the heavy influx of refugees consequent upon the emergence of East Pakistan and later Bangladesh as independent countries. Assam and northeastern hill states have somewhat belatedly woken up to the long-term implications of the continuous influx of outsiders into their territories and its effect on their cultural identity. The young prince, the reference here is to Palin Thonduk Namgyal, who was his batchmate at ICS, as early as 1950, was fully alive to the problems created by unrestricted immigration and settlement of outsiders in his little kingdom. His initiative came unhappily too late, and there was little that could be done to set back the advance of a process that had been set into motion since Claude White 50 years earlier. So this is the British policy of allowing migration, encouraging migration. So this is labor, tea plantations, that history. But he was determined to make a stand in defense of the Bhutia Lepcha communities that were in danger of being engulfed by the extraneous influx. He believed that unless a halt was called to the spread of the Nepalese contagion in every sphere, cultural, political, administrative, and religious, there was no hope of survival for the Lepcha and Bhutia communities. So, what is he saying here? Very long quote, sorry, but I'll end with this. I won't say anymore. What's he saying? Let's hear some of you. Come on, guys. Came all the way from Delhi. What's he, anything at all?
It sounds like Republican Party.
Very good. It actually does.
Right.
What sounds like it? Say more.
Well, it's more like a Trump speech because when you say outsiders infiltrating, to no hope for survival for the original people or the original Americans, whatever it is.
Very good.
So that is what like.
It sounds like
the
it.
new Americans.
Absolutely right. Yes. Okay. What's your name?
I'm Prasanna.
Prasanna. Okay. Anyone else? Silence is fine, really fine. What do you think? Any part of it that jumps at you?
The third last statement where there is written about the culture and all this stuff.
Sorry, say that again.
I'm looking here.
Okay.
I can
Yeah, sorry, I know it's very.
So-
should have put it in 2 slides. Yeah.
I mean, like, if they're taking it as an issue to preserve their own cultural identity, yet they first initiated to take them as a labor or for the labor work because their police allow it, and
That's right. That's right. So
So
they're fine as labor, but now that there are too many of them.
See them outcoming their own researches and all.
That's right. Yes. Very good.
Also, I think it highlights how maybe Prince Namgyal or the state of Bhutan or maybe
Sikkim.
Sikkim cannot handle themselves and they need outside assistance. That's inferred there, I guess.
Okay. And all of these words, are outsiders. I mean, look at the verbs here: infiltrating, expropriation, influx. We'd spoken earlier about, so what is it, what's at stake that, they would lose their identity. So here, no hope for survival, like what you're saying, So it's creating this danger, and danger is also used here. Contagion. So I mean, again, we are all too familiar, unfortunately, with this line of thinking, other contexts, other parts of the world, other historical contexts as well. And the comparison here with American Indians. Why do you think he's making that comparison? What is he trying to achieve with that?
And he's comparing the what you call the Lepchas or Bhutias as original
With-
natives,
Yes.
indigenous to that.
And the Nepalese with the white
Yeah.
colonizers. Yeah? Okay.
Who are also exploiters.
Who are exploiters. Yes, very good. So they're taking the resources. Yes. Any final thoughts? Okay, that's all I got. Thank you guys. Thank you. Thank you so much.
स्वातिजीलाई धन्यवाद। तपाईँहरूलाई उहाँलाई प्रश्न सोध्न मन लाग्यो भने नेपालीमा सोध्नु भए पनि हुन्छ। आई विल ट्रान्सलेट द्याट इन्टु इङ्ग्लिस फर हर अथवा कमेन्ट।
So,
डु यु वान्ट सम मोर टी?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was really less able to understand why he may have come up with this line of thoughts. And I have a couple of questions so that I will be able to
Sure.
understand. So, what was the rate of migration of Nepalese when Rustomji? So, the book was written in '97, so it's more like how he remembers.
87.
87.
1987. So, how he remembers his work in the past. What was the rate of migration first? Second, when he says Nepalese, what does he mean? Because Nepali does he mean people who speak the language Nepali, or does he mean that there are many ethnicities which can comprise
Yes.
Nepalese?
Yes.
Third is when he assumes that people in the plains are more superior to that of the fringes. Does he mean Bihar as means people of Bihar or Indo-Gangetic plain being as superior as people of maybe Maharashtra or Bengal or Kolkata, let's call it. So what does he actually? So it's actually unclear what he is. That's all from that.
Great. In your first three questions, so the second one, what does he mean by Nepalese? So think about these as census categories. Okay, so part of this, what is happening, and I actually didn't get the time to, thanks for your questions, now I can explain it. So in the 1941 census, the Nepalese were more than, so there are the Bhutias, the Lepchas, and the Limbus who are also of Nepali origin, but they are thought of as belonging to the Sikkimese stock. And then there are the Nepalese who come in later. Okay, so what the Sikkimese monarch is trying to do is to maintain this fiction that Sikkim is majority Buddhist. It's not. It's actually majority because the Nepalese are more than 50% per the 41 census. Okay, so I don't have the figures for the census in the 80s, but even in 1941, as the cabinet mission comes in, and they are, Sikkim and Bhutan are both saying that, we have a distinctly Buddhist way of life. it is already no longer true. Now the other problem, why does he have this bias? So one is that he has a personal friendship with the ruler, and he has a Tibetan Buddhist bias. So he feels that the Buddhists are superior. They're not just superior to the Nepalese, but they're also superior to the first quote I had shown of the original inhabitants. The idea that the people of the plains are superior, that's not really Rustomji. This is colonial thinking, that there is the Mongolian fringe and there are the peoples of the plains. So that idea is that, and this is actually echoed in Sardar Patel, so Sardar Patel and Nehru, as they are trying to, again, the question is a geopolitical question. How do we secure defenses? So this idea that we cannot trust the Himalayan populations because they are racially different. So they're not really saying that the Biharis are more superior or the Maharashtrians, but there is this sense that, and you're quite right, it is the Indo-Gangetic Valley. So that is, India proper. And then those in the fringes, maybe, so he says, for example, that the Nepalese and Sikkim feared that because the Prince Palinthondo Namgyal had married, his first marriage was to a Tibetan aristocrat's daughter. So this is the old Indian anxiety that we cannot trust these people because we don't know if their loyalties lie to their south, that is with India, or to their north. So that's Tibet and China. So, and the prince marrying, into the Tibetan aristocracy, as most many Sikkimese princes did at the time. And that, there are all these Tibetan guests in his house, there are mahjong parties, there's Tibetan food being served. So he says that the Nepalese and Sikkim are playing on India's anxieties about Tibetan encroachment, about Sikkim, Bhutan, about the Himalayas, going closer to Tibet, China. And of course, post-59, China, after the Dalai Lama is exiled in India. Does that answer your questions? Did it answer your questions? So the first one was the rate of migration. So I don't have the figures for the 80s, but by 41, like I said, a quarter of Bhutan and about half of Sikkim's population. This idea that, this we don't need to take seriously. Polygamous, they have too many children. The same thing you said, comparisons with the Republicans. They bring in their relatives. Everyone's bringing in their brothers and sisters, and there's just more and more. So that we don't, is it's not sort of, we can take that with a pinch of salt. But per the census, and actually the Sikkimese use the census data. So they say that this, now when do numbers become so important? When there is a technology to enumerate populations. So this is, again, there's literature on this, but the sense that if you can count, and then if you can count and the writing on the wall, Sikkim and Bhutan can see it, is democracy, that monarchy might not survive. So in a democracy, the majority matters. Okay, so why is the monarchy so anxious about the numbers? It's because the census is supplying them with that data. And there is the anxiety around minoritization of the so-called original. So this minority, majority, all of these are coming from the new technologies of enumeration and control under colonialism. So that's the language. So Sikkim actually says, and I found this in Rustomji's paper, there are press clippings of how in some parts of India the census data was misused. Or, some population use that data to then say, can we have a majority, like we are the majority. So therefore what? Therefore we should have more political rights. So the Nepalese and Sikkim are saying, for example, why can't education also be in Nepalese? Why is it that the Bhutias and Lepchas, who are a minority, hold most of the land? Why is it that in the Legislative Assembly, seats are created for them? So if you go just by the numeric principle, they're trying to subvert it by saying, okay, let's have special representation for monasteries. At one point, they say that if a Bhutia woman marries a Sherpa, she loses her title to her land. So all of these are ways of maintaining financial, economic, political, social control. and the anxiety around minoritization of the so-called original. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but I still, I don't know if I
No, maybe
but
I didn't understand
yeah,
your question.
when I asked who he means by Nepalese, it's clear to him that he was demonizing certain group of people who was
Who
were
had come in
speaking
more recently.
yeah, who were speaking in the Nepalese dialect or tongue.
Yes.
But what I am seeking to ask is that when when I hear the term Nepali, especially in the eastern way,
You're
I just
quite
don't
right.
understand to be someone who is a Brahman or a Kshatriya, but a Limbu, a Rai,
Yes,
a
yes.
Sherpa, as you.
No, you're quite
Who were the
right.
migrants? Who were the Limbus? Who were the Rai?
So they're not including the Limbus. So they say the Limbus are still part of the original inhabitants of Sikkim. And then there are these new settlers who, another term that's used is who preponderate in numbers. So the newer ones are the problem. The older ones are still more assimilated.
Because they are Buddhist and newcomers are maybe Hindus.
And they have come in more recently. So I mean, that's always part of it. Right? So perhaps they are poorer, they still have strong connections. So the other, and this I'll talk about on Friday as well, they say that it's the Nepalese from Darjeeling who are corrupting the minds of the Sikkim youth towards democracy. So this contagion of democracy is spreading, but we are doing very well, like we are a small country, a monarchy, we have a Buddhist way of life. So it's also that anxiety. So those who have connections, say in Darjeeling, they are the ones who are considered very threatening. But it's, I mean, you're quite right, it's not as stable, you can't say this person isn't, this person isn't. And that's perhaps also part of that anxiety, who's counted, who is not. Yeah. Anyone else?
I have one question.
Yes.
So in the quote,
अलिक स्वर चाहिँ अलिक ठुलो बनाउनु होला
so in the quote,
This one or the previous
yeah,
one?
this
one.
one, N.K. Rustom mentions about the initiative that young prince took. So, what were the initiatives that the prince took to stop Nepalese migrants from entering the Bhutanese?
So some of the initiatives is, so he tries to disenfranchise them. So one is, so for example, he says that they can't hold, so he tries to make sure that Bhutia and Lepcha lands through intermarriage cannot be, that they tries to secure that. The other is he has a lot of initiatives for the propagation of what he considers Sikkimese culture. So, which automatically leaves out the Nepalese. So, all the state symbols, the national anthem, the costume, the textbooks. So, he tries to quote unquote Sikkimize the curriculum. So, in terms of language, in terms of the history that is told of Sikkim, national symbols, all of these become increasingly exclusionary.
अरू सोधौँ सर त्यसपछि
Thank you, Dr. Chawla.
Thank you.
I have a little question.
Yes.
This may be beyond the discussion, but it is related with the topic.
Yes.
India is big in geography and also big in population.
Population, yes.
So my question is that why India takes the land of Sikkim? I read little about it. Sikkim was a different country than India.
Yes, till 1975.
Actually,
Yes, you're right.
why India takes the part of Sikkim? Because India is big in geography and population. And what it needs from the small countries, like from now 3 years back, even Nepal and India have had the same border problems. Even it had nowadays, and what the thought of India is in that context? What
कुरा एकचोटि बुझियो जस्तो
So yeah, no, I can't speak about the second question about the border with Nepal. But in response to your first question about Sikkim, where is Sikkim on the map?
nowadays
Yeah, always, not just now. What is to north of Sikkim?
near
Tibet.
Tibet. Yeah. What is to right and left?
Here Nepal and here India and
Bhutan.
Bhutan.
And south? India. So is that a clue for your answer? Why is Sikkim so important to India?
That's answer is like that, ma'am. I'm big brother, and there are other small sister and brother, and I can beat you and I can capture you with my.
That's part of it. But also where it is strategically. Right, so strategically, so again, if you see, I mean, India is big, we should have had a map. And the northeastern states. So if you actually look at where Sikkim is placed, strategically it's very important, okay? So also after the Dalai Lama comes into exile and Tibet is controlled by China, it becomes even more important. So 59, the Dalai Lama comes into exile, 62, India-China war. So all of that is part of the reason. Now, I mean, the Big Brother attitude is, that's also, yes, I'm not denying that. But also if you look at just where it is. And so just to give you, just one more example, this is from Bhutan. So Bhutan, I'm forgetting the year, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, changes its national time. Now, Nepal, as you know, is 15 minutes ahead of India. Bhutanese national time used to be tied to India. It was the same as India, and Bhutan changes it. Now, the Indian appointee in Bhutan gets very anxious about that. So they say, the Bhutanese had no problem with Indian time, and now they're changing their time. This is one more step. They're asserting their difference from India. Now, why would India be so anxious about Bhutan changing its time? If you think about it, it's a different country. It's also, east, maybe they felt, because there are parts of India that are east, even further east of Bhutan. So the answer to that question is just look at the map and then see what is happening, in the region in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But it's a good question. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could say two things. One is you refer to the personal papers of Rustomji in what we used to call Nehru Memorial Museum.
Yes.
Now, under Modi, the name has
Prime
been changed.
Minister's Museum.
So, what's the extent of that collection, and what have you looked at there in terms of informing this research project, and also something more about where this paper falls in whatever you're trying to do in bigger projects, because I'm sure you can find a whole series of writers who are not necessarily elite civil servants who would have written in very much the same lexicon about Sikkim and or about Nepalese overrunning both Sikkim and Bhutan and so forth. So why this guy, and where is the project in which this particular
fits.
thing falls?
Yeah. So the extent, this is actually a very vast collection. I have looked at mostly the subject files and his correspondence. So most of this is from the time that he was posted in Sikkim, Bhutan and Assam. He has extensive correspondence with Palin Thonduk Namgyal. In fact, even his wife, second wife, Abi Rustomji, has a correspondence with Jigme Dorji's widow. And those letters talk about the coming of Tibetan refugees. So Jigme Dorji's widow actually subsequently marries a Tibetan refugee. and she talks about the early rehabilitation efforts. Again, the Bhutanese king features there. So does the Dalai Lama. So there is the personal correspondence, and then there are speeches and letters from his time in Sikkim, Bhutan, and other parts of the Northeast. Why Rustomji, and where does it fall in the bigger project? So essentially, I was trying to, when I started my dissertation work, I wanted to write about Tibetan exile. That was my MPhil work at Delhi University. And I was in a department of English, so I was very curious also about, all of your disciplinary affiliations. And I wanted to write about Tibetan national culture in exile. And I focused on a museum and a nunnery. Now, when I went to the Department of History, I was told historians work on dead people and we work with archives. And I, having grown up in India, I did my BA, MA, MPhil, everything from Delhi University, actually did not know about Sikkim, Bhutan, and Tibet as constituting what was then called a Himalayan triangle. And I asked myself, I know Tibetan, but I don't know Mandarin. How is this a story? I mean, it is a story of Sikkim and Bhutan, but it is also a story about India. So the story, and by Rustomji, is what does it tell us about the forging of India in the post-colonial period and the role of the Himalaya there. So these officials who are borrowing from colonial lexicon, and him, because he is very good friends with Dorji and Namgyal, what is it telling us about how the Indian Republic is, and the emphasis here, in fact, the course I teach in Jindal is called the forging of post-colonial India. So it doesn't come, the map is not inherited from the British, it is actually painstakingly forged, and Sikkim becomes part of India in 75. So what is it, why is it that this process and how takes all these decades? And what does it tell us about India? So not what it tells us about Sikkim and Bhutan. So I thought the attitude of officials like Rustomji, Apabi Pant is another figure who I talk about in my work, Homi Talyar Khan. So I'm actually looking at the private papers, and they're all at Teen Murti, of all the Indian appointees in Sikkim and Bhutan. So Rustomji is just one, but there are many others. So how are they describing Sikkim and Bhutan? So what's the, how much of this is coming from, this kind of the Sardar Patel thinking, Sardar Patel and Menon, or this is, many of them are also very enamored of Tibet. They meet the Dalai Lama, they find him very charismatic. So there's a little bit of that. So what does this tell us about India in the 50s, 60s? That's the bigger story, and this is part of it. So my book project is actually on Sikkim from the cabinet mission to 1975, and one part of this is looking at Indian officials posted in Sikkim, and in my dissertation I wouldn't say I compare, but I also refer to Basil Good and Hopkinson, so the British officials, and how they are writing about Tibet. And many of these appointees overlap. So they're in Sikkim for some time, then they're posted in Tibet. So it's charting like from the early 20th century, through the 1970s, what's the thinking about the Himalaya, and then what does it tell us about post-colonial India?
Aru, you wanted to ask something?
So another question is that you as a researcher, do you think, was it really happening, the Nepali migrants encroaching the community and putting Bhutia Lipcha's identity in crisis, or it was just a line of thought and their anxiety acting?
So historians usually refrain from adjudicating like this, so that I can tell you. So what I can say is that there is a lot of sympathy. So since we're talking about Rustomji, a lot of sympathy for. So if you just read Rustomji and Palintonduk Namgyal's letters to him, there is a genuine anxiety that Sikkim is a small kingdom. So, exactly what the person before you said. India is a large country. And this is a small kingdom. It has a very unique way of life. Tibet is already, what's happening in Tibet from the 40s onwards. When the Dalai Lama comes to India in 1956, this is the 2500th Buddha Jayanti celebrations. The Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama come, and there is this sense that things are not good in Tibet. So there is something we need to preserve, and we are a small kingdom. So this anxiety about the Nepalese is also connected. It's actually the Nepalese that want a merger with India. So this idea that if Sikkim joined India,
Sorry to interrupt you. Was Sikkim being anxious because of what was happening in Tibet, like
yes.
China invading the Tibet?
Yes, so partly yes, because as I told you, Thondup Namgyal is married into Tibetan aristocracy. So when his first child is born, the custom is that you take the child, and you go to your wife's house. So he goes to visit his father-in-law, and he sees firsthand what's happening. So he says, I see so many Chinese in Lhasa, and the Chinese are not letting me travel very freely. I can't take photographs in Lhasa. So he can see what's happening in China, and he's of course anxious for his kingdom. But this anxiety is even before what happens in Tibet. So even in the 40s, when he sees that India is going to become independent, so both Sikkim and Bhutan, at one point, the Bhutanese send a memo, to the cabinet mission, and Bhutan and Sikkim had both ceded territories to British India. So in the Bhutanese memo, the Bhutanese say, the territories that we ceded to you, Baksa Duar, for example, Divankiri, you are returning India to Indians, return Bhutanese territory to Bhutan. So there is this anxiety that, what is going to happen? The British recognized our special, quote unquote, special relationship. What if independent India doesn't? And the fact that India is very large and these are smaller kingdoms, they have always depended for their defense, communications, and foreign affairs on British India. So that is not lost on anybody. So whether or not this is happening, this sense that he might lose his kingdom, and of course, many of us, we might not want to feel very sympathetic for a prince who wants to hold on to his kingdom. I mean, why should we? But it's very real. So he sees what's happening in India, what happened with the other princely states. So Hyderabad, some of you might know, is a large princely state. Okay, large, it's rich. So they say if something like, if a state like Hyderabad couldn't hold on its own, what future, does my small kingdom have? So Hyderabad, some of the bigger ones that actually had more resources. So they see all of this in, they see it in that context.
I meant one question. So don't you think it is like an irony, because they wanted to protect by Nepal being overrun, I mean Nepal overrunning Sikkim, and the result is they are merged with India. So don't you think that's a kind of irony is there? And other few things I would like to, it's not related with that. So all these things are, they are really negative aspects of the migration, because they may have also contributed to the development of Sikkim. Just like those works which they are not doing, these migrant workers may have been doing. And the thing is about the problem or the danger in the culture and identity. So you have mentioned that in Gulf countries also, more than 80% of the people are from the outside, in India, Nepal, and other things. But they are very, very able to maintain their culture, religion, everything is maintained by them. So it's all, I have a feeling that all these things we are dealing with the negative aspects only. So what do you think about that?
So I think on the second part of your question, I completely agree with you. So, this is, I'm not sort of holding this up as something I believe. In fact, why we sort of spend so much time unpacking it is to precisely bring about all the contradictions that you mentioned. Your first question about that Sikkim does eventually become part of India. So this is, this I would say as a historian, and this is a methods thing. when we look at historical sources, say from 40s, 50s, 60s, I mean, this is from the 80s, do not look at them, try as far as possible to not look at them retrospectively from what happened. So in the 50s, the Sikkimese prince doesn't know that in 1975 his kingdom would, Sikkim would become part of India, that it would become the last state to join the kingdom. He's looking at Bhutan, he looks at Nepal. In fact, Olaf Karo says that Sikkim, even in 1940, is jealous of Nepal. That, the British never considered Nepal as one of the princely states. With Sikkim and Bhutan, and this I explore in my larger work, is always it's a question. Is Bhutan a princely state? Is Sikkim like the other states? About Nepal, there isn't. It's very clear that it's independent. So they don't know at this time. Okay, so when he looks at Bhutan, Bhutan eventually joins the United Nations. So he also has these hopes for his kingdom, that it would be able to hold on. So we read this source, try to read it as much as possible, as an artifact of its time, not of our time. So not the map that it is today, but what it was then, and what's happening in the region around it. Who is he talking to? So he has relatives in Tibet, he has relatives in Bhutan, he has all these connections in India. So Rustomji, who's his friend, Rustomji is an Indian official, but he is sympathetic to the plight of Sikkim and Bhutan. So we try as much as possible to read that source in that light. I don't know if that answered your question satisfactorily. You don't look very happy with the answer. So,
Arukita. It looks like there are no questions about today's presentation. Do you want to say a few things about the history program at Jindal?
Sure. We actually just started a PhD program as well, so if any of you want to come and apply. So history is part of the program of liberal arts and humanities. So we have many other disciplinary majors. History is just one of them. You take as part of the undergraduate program what we call a foundation course in history. So that's really, we take you from the Indus Valley, through post-colonial India. We talk a little bit about the emergence of Islam, about the Renaissance, the freedom movement, and beyond. So that's a broad-based foundation course. We have a methods course that we call Thinking About the Field. So where we actually do what I just tried to do with you, go through different methods that social science scholars, but especially historians and sociologists, so those are the two groups that offer the course together, use in thinking about their field. So for us, it would be archives or personal papers, photographs, etc. I am the director of what we call the postgraduate research and diploma in innovation, postgraduate diploma in research and innovation, PGDRI program at Jindal, where for 1 year you work on a project and you write a thesis, and you do a 4-month internship related to your discipline as part of that. So if any of you or your friends want to do not quite a PhD thesis right now, but akin to a master's thesis, that is one more program. There are a range of histories offered, not just in my department, which is liberal arts and humanities, but there are historians across different schools in Jindal. So our law program is the largest one. So there are many historians in the law school, in the journalism and public policy school, in the governance school. So students can take electives across different schools. And like I said, we just started a PhD program as well. So yeah, and also, sorry, one more thing. This is shameless plug for me. Every summer and every winter, I recruit about a dozen interns to work with me virtually on looking at archival materials on Sikkim and Bhutan. So if you know anybody who wants training in archival methods and is interested in the region, they can write to me. So it usually, the summer internship starts in the middle of May through the end of July, any 4 weeks. And the winter one starts on 15th November and through the end of Jan, any 4 weeks. So if anyone's interested in the archives and they want to work with me, write to me.
how's the PhD program being planned? Like you said, it's just been started. So, is it PhD by dissertation or coursework leading to the use of
both? So the PhD is under the Office of Doctoral Services. So there is some coursework that's common to. So it's a few methods courses. Then PhD students can also take electives, and then leading to the dissertations. I believe it's a 4-year program. I might be mistaken. It might be 3 or 5, but I think it's 4.
So, in other words, the PhD program is not fully run by the department, but there's
the office. It's through the
Okay.
Office of Doctoral Services.
Why is that so?
Don't know. I think it's because there are all these different schools, and they want to maintain some parity across, how the different schools do it.
Yeah.
So I want to bring you back to what she asked.
Mhm.
She asked whether the Nepalese were exploiters. When I see migration, I see it through 3 lenses if it has any, sort of influence in the said region. One is, has there been an influx in political power of such community? So, where does the Nepalese community stand in that regard? Were there any, big political leaders or organizations that profoundly advocated for Nepalese people's right? Or, as you suggested, they were more akin to being a part of India than the Debsas of Sikkim or maybe Bhutias of Bhutan. So, what's the case in that regard? Second is, the labor population that works there, or people who work in small business. How far was there influence? So if you go to have tea and there are only options that Nepalese are the ones selling tea, or if you want to a piece of cloth, Nepalese are selling it, or maybe if you want someone to clean your house, it's Nepalese. So was that the case? How was the labor migrant situation there? And how was, relative to that time, the business people who were gaining rather huge influence in that region and were also Nepalese, whatever the definition that Rustomji or the prince was defining?
Thank you. So one limitation of sources like these is they are elite sources, right? So Rustomji is an elite Indian official. His correspondence that I cite is mostly with Thondup Namgyal, who is the prince, or he's talking to people in the Ministry of External Affairs, the Ministry of Home Affairs. So these sources at least, and this is, like I said, very much a limitation, don't quite get at your second question, so I can't answer that. But there's a very good book by E.K. Santha called Democracy in Sikkim that talks about some of this. Can pull up the reference later. But to your first and your third question, so the third question, the business, not just the Nepalese, but actually more so the Marwadis. And again, there's a lot of literature on the Marwadis. Could the Marwadis be considered old settlers in Sikkim? So 3 years back or 4 years back, Asian Ethnicity did actually a special issue on Sikkim, which talked about, some of these. And there's a paper on the Marwadis. And again, in these sources at least, there is this prejudice against the business people. So, they have money and, now they're trying to increase their influence. And the Marwadis are also, like the Nepalese, considered settlers. Doesn't matter how long they have been in Sikkim, but they are outsiders, they are settlers, they keep to themselves, and their loyalty is with India. That is always assumed. But to your first question, and that's actually the heart of, why the prince is so anxious. They do hold political power, and mostly because, like I said, with technologies like the sensors, if you can see that the numbers, and if the writing on the wall, now this is again the longer context of the integration of princely states into the Indian Union. So they can see that none of the princes were able to hold on. That democracy is, like I said, it is the writing on the wall. So if Sikkim were to become, if it wasn't going to be a monarchy, if it would be a democracy, then who is the community in minority and who is in majority? And so there is this other character who, we don't have beyond the scope of this paper to get into. The Qazi in Sikkim is the prince suspects, and he is, these are all these political power centers, that he is cultivating the Nepalese. And the Nepalese, the political parties that emerge in Sikkim. So there's also in the nationalist movement, the Praja Mandal movement in different states. The Praja Mandals within the princely states are for democracy, okay, for overthrowing the ruler. So the Praja Mandal movement that gains strength, especially in Darjeeling, the Thondup Namgyal and his father talk about it. Even they're even writing to the British saying, we don't have a problem with the British. It's the Nepalese contagion that's spreading democracy. They are turning the heads of the original inhabitants of Sikkim for democracy. So the merger with India, the subsequent merger, it's not just India culturally, but it's also democracy versus monarchy. So in terms of the political power and the different political parties in Sikkim at the time, so some are considered, close to the ruler, the others are considered pro-democracy, wanting to get rid of the ruler and closer to India. So the question that Dr. Onda asked, why look at someone like Rustomji? So not just Rustomji, but when we see the private papers of the governors, other governors and divans who are Indian appointees in Sikkim, who are they talking to? So they are often talking to the Nepalese leaders. So the suspicion is that they are trying to cultivate them and they're trying to pave the way for the merger. But E.K. Santha's book, I think, will speak to your second question.
Just one objective question.
Yes.
How hard or how far was the travel from Gangtok to Lhasa during that time? Before Dalai Lama set foot in 56.
So if you see, Lhasa is actually closer than Calcutta from Gangtok. So I don't know how many days the travel took.
It was by foot or?
Yak, partly. So I don't know if you would go directly from the passes, Jelepla and Nathula in Sikkim towards Tibet. Yeah, but I don't know exactly how many days it took. Sorry about that. But the fact that it's closer than Calcutta and definitely closer than Delhi is noted. So that tying to the other question about why is Sikkim so strategically important? Because it could very easily, you could imagine. So at one point there is a slogan in one of the youth demonstrations that we shall move north. And India gets very anxious. Like, so if we look from Sikkim, what does moving north mean? And so the shifty, sort of the assumption that we cannot be very sure if they're going to be loyal. So that's exacerbated by these distances. Thank you.
On behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank Swati for the presentation today and for giving us the reason to be all here. So
and thank you for all the questions. Thank you.
But if you have friends, if you are considering to do a PhD in history,
yes,
please talk to her.
Or just an archival internship, whatever discipline you're in.
If you have friends who are looking for a good place to go to, do you guys provide fellowship for PhD students?
We do. And a place to stay.
All the good reasons. And why you might want to consider doing a PhD in history outside of Nepal. If you're interested in that, you should read my article published in the Kathmandu Post on Friday of last week. Not day before yesterday, but the week before, where I basically suggested why the history of Nepal, the crowd that works on history of Nepal is a very insular crowd, mostly trained at Tribhuvan, since there's been very little interest in doing research or history from history departments on Nepal from outside of Nepal. And so I suggested that if people want to go, there are many good universities in India that they could consider. I didn't name any university, but I should have asked you.
Thank you.
Jindal is one place. Okay, सबैजना धन्यवाद। मैले अघि भने जस्तै बुधबारदेखि हाम्रो कन्फरेन्स सुरु हुन्छ। तपाईहरुलाई आउनु मन लाग्छ भने चाहिँ आउनु उपाय बाँकी छ। Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all your questions, guys.